In this captivating video, Andrew Huberman delves into the fascinating realm of fear by dissecting the fearless mentality of David Goggins. Huberman's exploration sheds light on the extraordinary resilience and mental fortitude displayed by Goggins, demonstrating that fear can be conquered with the right mindset and the right approach.
You had David Goggins in the lab to study him for fear. What did you learn from looking at that guy?
Yeah, David's great. I always chuckle with David because, the one thing about David is what you see on social media is actually what you get when you interact with David.
By breaking down Goggins' experiences, Huberman provides practical insights into overcoming fear and unlocking one's true potential.
The night before we had this event, he came out to the lab. My lab, we study fear, we study courage, we study resilience, and we study the underlying neurochemical substrates for those. So we had a bunch of guys there, a couple team guys, some other folks, and we bring them in this little room and we do virtual reality there. And one of the things that we use to scare people or to generate a sense of autonomic arousal is this experience of diving with great white sharks, which of course you're not in water in the laboratory, but it's very immersive. And for people that are afraid of sharks, it can be quite scary. Not always, but we also have heights, we have claustrophobia, we got something where you can feel spiders crawling all over your body if you're an arachnophobe. If you have a pain point, we find it. Whatever goes on in that abstraction part of the brain, he's figured out how to dig down in whatever the limbic friction. Yeah. He's figured out how to grab a hold of that, scruff it, and send it in the direction that he's decided it needs to go. And what's wild is that what we're talking about is him doing that to himself, right? It's like he's scruffing himself and directing himself in a particular direction and sending himself down that trajectory. And what's beautiful is that he acknowledges that process is not pretty. It doesn't feel good. It's kind of horrible at every level, but he's created this rewarding element to it. And I think that's what's it's so admirable, and it's what so many people crave, which is regulation of the self at that level. What's interesting, earlier we were talking about the challenge with David that you're about to do. Yeah. I mean, that is a psychedelic experience of sorts because you're biasing your mind towards a pretty extreme neurochemical state, and you don't know what you're going to find there. And that's kind of the excitement. At least for me as an observer, it's like, I want to know what the experience is like afterward. I want to know, like, how was it? I mean, I'm sure you're going to get something. Like you said, you're going to grow. The question is how. Well, stress has these two sides. The limbic friction of being tired and needing to get more energized. That's one form of stress. And then there's the feeling too amped up and needing to calm down. Yeah. The typical discussion around stress is one thing, but it's all limbic friction. It's just that when I say limbic friction, that's not a real scientific term. I just mean the limbic system wanting to pull you down into sleep or wanting to put you into panic, and you using top-down processing, using that evolved forebrain to say, I'm not going to go to sleep, and I'm not going to freak out. And those top-down control mechanisms are, I mean, when those get honed, that's beautiful, because then you're increasing capacity for everything. Long hours one day, and everyone was ready to tap out. This was a bunch of people in Silicon Valley for a day, doing some workshop type thing. And he was changing into his running shorts midway. He was going to run to the airport, and he ran to the airport, as far as I know.
To get his flight?
I believe so, But there was this moment of, should we continue? Should we take a break? And he was like, no, let's keep going. Everything you see and read and hear about David is exactly how he shows up. It's really wonderful. He came to the lab, and he did, we have a virtual version of the shark thing, which of course is not the same as the real experience. But for people who are afraid of sharks, it's quite scary for them and allows us to study fear. David he's very afraid of sharks, which was sort of amusing to me, given that as a SEAL, he had to spend a lot of time in water. But he was first one in, wanted to do the VR, talked about how he didn't like it, but that's why he did it. Constant testing himself. In fact, I think even though David's quite successful, and has many, many options of how to spend his time, I believe this is correct, that I think right now he's doing fire jumping. He's fighting fires in the wilderness by zip lining in or fast lining in or jumping out of planes. So he's constantly pushing that friction lever to create
or build or further build this thing about leaning into friction. And this is a term that isn't really scientific, but that I decided to coin because this idea of limbic friction, that when we're very tired and we need to be in action, or when we're very stressed and we need to perform in a more calm and controlled way, there's friction on both sides. Getting out of bed when we're exhausted, hard, very hard often. Leaning into action in a calm and deliberate way when we're freaking out, like going to give a public lecture if one has fear of public speaking, also hard. So this limbic friction, and David just seems to seek what I call limbic friction in every domain of life.
Is that like exposure therapy for limbic friction then?
Essentially, yeah. I mean, what you're training and improving when you're getting better at dealing with stress is this ability to tolerate high amounts of adrenaline in your body.
So I sort of explained what the platform was and what we were going to do, and David said, he goes, "I don't like sharks." And I was like, all right, well. And so then, this was not a typical experimental day in the lab. So I just kind of, at one point I finished describing what the tech is and how we're going to wire people in. And then I said, so who wants to go first? And he's like, I'll go.
Right, of course.
And what was funny to me at that moment, I realized this is interesting because he was very explicit about the fact he didn't like sharks. He was very explicit about the fact that he was going to be first man in. I mean, it would be inappropriate for me to describe his data, right? And we didn't do a full-blown experiment. But what I can say is whatever it is that David has figured out how to do, it clearly involves taking whatever adrenaline pulse he feels and understanding something fundamental to biology, which is that adrenaline response was designed to move us, not to keep us stationary. He uses behavior as the way to shift sensation, perception, feelings, and thoughts. He understands how to run that program in the right direction. Whereas most people, when they don't like what they feel, they start negotiating sensation, which will never work. They start trying to control their perception, which is hard, right? They're like, oh, I'm not gonna think about that, or I'll think about it differently. Very hard to control the mind with the mind. He knows that's a tough one.
Yeah.
I think I don't often comment on people's stuff, but I think I commented something like neural plasticity loves a non-negotiable rule. No, I said a non-negotiable contract. Because at the point where, neuroplasticity really loves a non-negotiable contract because, and I've said this before, so forgive me, but, the brain is doing analysis of duration, path, and outcome, and that's a lot of work for the brain. And the more that it can pass off duration, path, and outcome to just reflex, the more energy and it can allocate to other things. So if you decide, there's no negotiation about how many push-ups, how far I'm going to run, how many days, how many pull-ups, etc. You actually have more energy for push-ups, running, and pull-ups. I mean, so much of what we do is reflexive at the level of just core circuitry, breathing, heart rate, all that boring stuff, digestion. But then there's a lot of reflexive stuff like how you drink out of a mug of coffee that's reflexive too, but that you had to learn at some point in your life earlier when you were very little, analyzing duration, path, and outcome. And that involved a lot of top-down processing with the prefrontal cortex. But through plasticity mechanisms, you now do it. So when you take on a challenge, provided that you understand the core mechanics of how to, run push-ups and pull-ups and whatever else you decided to do, once you set the number and the duration and all that, then all you have to do is just go. But people get caught in that tide pool of just, well, do I really have to do it? How do I not do that? What if I get injured? What if I, can I sneak a this or that, and that's work. Yeah. And to some extent, I not David Goggins, obviously, nor do I claim to understand his process partially, but maybe a little bit, which is that it's clear that by making the decision, there's more resources to devote to the effort of the actual execution. The hormone augmentation thing is always a little bit of a complicated discussion, but there's so much that's happening there right now that's really interesting.
Like what?
Well, for instance, sort of back to the topic of supplements, I always say, look, their behaviors are the fundamental layer. You have to do the right things for anything, for sleep, for learning, for sports performance. But then there's nutrition, supplementation, prescription drugs, and then off-label stuff, right? And so we always think about, when you hear hormones in sports, you always think just the raw conversation about anabolics, all the banned stuff. We could talk about that stuff and how it works. Years ago, I used to work on androgens, testosterone, and its derivatives and how it impacts brain development and body function, fear, and also mental states. But there's a category of supplements that are very interesting that for most people who aren't exploring testosterone augmentation for sport, work very well to increase testosterone by about 100 to 200 points. Not, 300, not a tripling or anything like that. And the main ones are two substances. One is called Tongat Ali.
Oh yeah, that stuff's real, huh?
Yeah. Oh yeah, because what happens is the testosterone molecule, it's basically carried in a cargo. So it can be in its free form, unbound form, free testosterone. And everyone says, oh, I want more free testosterone. You want more, but these what are called sex hormone binding globulins. So there's something called sex hormone binding globulin and albumin. They carry the testosterone molecule to the different tissues of the body. So you don't want all your testosterone free. You want some of it bound up so that it can be delivered to the different tissues, including your brain. But if you have too much sex hormone binding globulin, the testosterone can't really do its things, okay? There is one thing I want to mention. There's some very good physiology that can perhaps support the actual running effort part. Mm-hmm. These are very new data. And we have a study going on with David Spiegel at Stanford looking at how different patterns of breathing can affect heart rate variability. Heart rate variability is good. There's this interesting mechanism that I think most people might not realize, but that medical students learn that your breathing and your heart rate and your brain are in this really remarkable interplay. It goes like this. When you inhale, this isn't breath work. We're not going to do breath work. But when you inhale, the diaphragm moves down. The heart gets a little bigger because there's a little more space in the thoracic cavity. And as a consequence, blood flows a little bit more slowly through that larger volume. And there's a category of neurons, the sinoatrial node, that sees that recognizes that slower rate through that larger volume. It sends a signal to the brainstem, and the brainstem sends a signal back to the heart to speed the heart up. Mm-hmm. So every time you inhale, you're speeding the heart up. When you exhale, the diaphragm moves up, the heart gets a little smaller, the volume is smaller, blood flows more quickly through the heart, signal sent up to the brain, and the brain sends a signal back to slow the heart down. This is the basis of heart rate variability. So at any point, if you feel like your heart is racing and you feel like you're working too hard per unit of effort, focus on making your exhales longer or more intense than your inhales. If ever you feel like you're truly flagging, you do not have the energy to get up, it's like, okay, it's time to go, and you're exhausted, you want to draw more oxygen into the system, get your heart rate going fast.
Feelings, Lord knows what those are and how to control them. I mean, we'll eventually figure that out as a field, but thoughts are complicated. So he just goes immediately to action.
He goes forward.
Immediately
right
to
towards
action.
it. So when he says, just for clarity, when he says, I don't like sharks, he's basically saying, put me in the shark tank. Like he's cueing you to say, this is the thing I'm afraid of, and I'm going to be the first one to volunteer, and I know you're going to put me in the shark tank if I tell you that.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think, and I obviously can't speak for him, but one of the things I think is very clear is that he's tapped into this neuroplasticity process through the door, through the portal of agitation and stress. He's figured out, and this is really the holy grail of neuroscience, is how can I modify my brain? Well, you modify it by placing yourself into discomfort and using that as a propeller to move you into action. And a couple years later, when David was working on his book, and I heard the book was coming out, I think I saw a pre-release announcement. I texted him and I just said, "Look, I'm really excited to see your book." And he said, "Oh, great, thank you. It'd be great if you'd write something about it, like an endorsement." I said, "Oh, I'd be honored to. I'm happy to." And he said, "But I need it tonight."
Right.
And this was Saturday at, I think it was like 10:30 at night when I texted him. So I said, "Great, well, I'd be happy to. I won't do it now." And he said, "I need it by midnight." So I sit down and I start writing this thing. And these are short blurbs, but I kind of realized that, you want to get it right. It's David, and my name's next to it, and I want to do it justice. So I'm sitting down, I'm working on this thing, and I text him, "Look, I'm going to be a few minutes late. No problem. Finally, I send him the thing at like 12:30 at night. And he's like, "Oh, bro, thank you. I promise I'll send you a copy," this and that. And I was like, grateful, thank you. And then I realized that that time he was living in New York. And I said, "Wait a second, where are you?" He said, "New York." And I said, "It's 3:30 in the morning." And he goes, "Yeah, I'm going running."
Of course.
And I realized at that point, I was like, okay, it's undisputable.
Right.
This guy lives the persona that he projects into the world. And even that day, that consulting gig, there was a 4:00 lag, and he was like, "No, let's keep going." So he's figured something out. And I think that his enormous popularity it's earned because he's figured out that it really doesn't matter if you come at something from a place of joy and love, and that would be wonderful. But there's a whole other set of ways to approach this that involve slogging through the discomfort, the doubts, the wish for things to be different, and starting with behavior. Yeah. And it's incredible because if you think about sensation, perception, feeling, thought, and behavior, actually the way to control our nervous system and feel the way we want to feel is to run that backwards. Behavior, thoughts. So if you change your behavior, then generally your thoughts, your feelings, and your perceptions change.
Yeah.
And everyone tries to come at it from the other end, but he's figured out through whatever process led him there and incredible life circumstances, how to run it in this direction of behavior first.
Yeah.
And I really think that if neuroscience has anything to offer, it's some understanding of what the underlying chemicals and neural circuits are. But the sooner that the human animal, the human species can start to understand that our feelings and our thoughts and our memories and all that is very complicated, but that when behaviors are very concrete, and they are the control panel for the rest of it.